أروي لكم عن قصة للمصطفى إذ قام يوما في الجهاد منظما رص الصفوف كما الصلاة تصفهم فكأنهم بنيان سد وحكيما وتجول المختار بين صفوفهم فإذا بشخص بينهم متقدما قد غير الصف القاوم خروجه نظر الرسول إليه ثم تبسما وبعود غصن للصفوف أعاده وأعاد للصف القاوم تقوما قال الفتى في رقة وتمسكن يشكو إلى المختار منه تألما آلمتني بالعود يا خير الورى فاستغرب الجمع الغافير وهمهما ما ظنكم ماذا يكون جوابه هذا رسول حاز خلقا عظيما فتأملوا في عيد ومجند قد أزهر الإسلام عدلا فيهما هذا محمد كاشفا عن بطنه تفديه روحي مرسلا ومعلما يعطيه ذاك العود دون تردد ويقول خذ مني القصاص مسلما فإذا به في لهفات وتشوق وكأنه يروي الفؤاد من الظما يدشو سواد كي يضم حبيبه لم يستطع من شوقه أن يحجما ويعانق البطن الشريف بوجهه متبركا متمرغا كي يغنما يا سعداه قد نال حظا وفيرا أصغوا إلى ما قال حين تكلما يا سيدي إني خرجت مجاهدا وعدنا جيش يسير عرماما لا علم لي إن كنت أمسي بينكم حيا لعلي أو قاتلا ربما فإذا قتلت فلست أدري مؤلي في جنات أم في سعير أضرما، لكن جلدي مس جلدك علاني، أمضي وجلدي عن جهنم حرما. صلى عليك الله يا خير الورى، قد صار حبك في الشرايين دما. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب صل عليه وسلم. اللهم صل يا رب صل عليه وسلم. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب صل. إن قيل زرتم بما رجعتم، إن قيل زرتم بما رجعتم، يا أكرم الرسل ما نقول، قولوا رجعنا بكل خير، واجتمع الفرع والأصول. اللهم صل يا رب صل عليه وسلم. اللهم صل عليه وسلم. لولاك يا زينة الوجود، لولاك يا زينة الوجود، ما طاب عيشي ولا وجودي، ولا ترنمت في صلاتي ولا ركوعي ولا سجودي. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب سلم. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب صل. لما يا ليالي الرضا علينا، يا ليالي الرضا علينا، عودي ليخضر منك عودي، عودي علينا بكل خير، بالمصطفى الطيب الجدود. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب عليه وسلم. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب صل. ثم الصلاة على نبينا، ثم الصلاة على نبينا وآله الركع السجود. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب. اللهم صل على محمد يا رب صل وسلم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. That we hope that just inshallah ta'ala the rain is pouring down outwardly, that the rain of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is pouring down upon us inwardly. And inshallah ta'ala we have hearts that are fertile and ready to receive. In particular, may it be a means of special preparation for this blessed month of Ramadan. May Allah ta'ala place immense blessing in all of the remaining days of Sha'ban, and every single hour of Sha'ban, and minute of Sha'ban, and moment of Sha'ban, and prepare us for the entrance of the blessed month of Ramadan, such that the moon is not seen, and then we start Taraweeh the night before the day of the first fast, except that we're ready for the very first night, which is called Laylat al-Nadra, the night of the gaze. This is a night that many people and many believers are in a state of hedonism regarding, because they think that Ramadan starts with the fast. Ramadan actually starts with the Salat al-Maghrib coming in and the moon being seen. And that's when Ramadan really begins. And the first night of Ramadan is of the utmost importance, just as every night in Ramadan is important, and even the very last night is also important as we transition out of Ramadan into the month of Shawwal that comes after it. And hopefully that we've learned a little bit from our study of this blessed book, of the book 21 of the Iḥyā Ulūm, how it is that we need to be inwardly in order to be able to receive the outpour of His bounty, Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And we're going to be taking here shortly a metaphor for the light of knowledge that's in the heart of the believers. But you can also understand is that also in relation to the metaphor of light, there's different degrees that of outpour, if you will, that comes to the heart of the righteous. And sometimes it's just a very light rain and a very light sprinkle. And other times that it's raining pretty hard. And other times that there's a torrential rain. And I remember one time visiting with one of our teachers, Niagara Falls on the Canadian side. And you can kind of go down below and you can actually look out and to see how powerful the outpour is when the water's actually falling. And that this meaning came to the heart is this was happening to the hearts of the awliya, is that there's this very strong outpour of mercy that is upon their hearts and every single moment. What we want to do is to learn how that our hearts can be like those hearts. And it begins with knowledge and a recognition that there's a path that we have to embark upon and take. And when we connect ourselves to these blessed people, and we learn what it is that we need to learn, put into practice what it is that we need to practice, and maintain sincerity and trust in Allah Ta'ala, He's too generous to make us aware of the path, to connect us to the people of the path, to do what it is that we can to strive upon the path, and then not give us, subhanahu wa ta'ala, what He gives those who are successful in the path. May Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq. Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. These retreats pass by very quickly, subhanallah. I think we're going to have to make the decision this year to do these every month. There's nothing better than to spend time studying this blessed work of the Iḥyā Ulūm. One of the things that came clear this morning when we were talking about these meanings, and one of our brothers who had a nice reflection that he shared, how unfortunately this knowledge that we're learning is not being taught the way that it should. And the scholars of this science say is that this science, i.e. the science of tasawwuf, the science of the heart, the science of purification of the soul, is a science that we are in absolute need of in every single moment. It is like staple food. We can't go without it. And it's for this reason they actually recommend that we study this science daily. Just as you're not going to go a day without food, you shouldn't go daily without studying a book of this sort. And they even recommend that we might keep a book of this science by our nightstand or someplace that we sit when we read, to even if it be a paragraph, even if it be a page or 2 or 3 pages, is that we're constantly engaging in these meanings. And we move from book to book and we repeat other books. And these are not books that we just read and like, oh, I read it, as if it's some book on history or some book of fiction or something. No, these are books that we read over and over and over again. And our teachers and many of the other spiritual paths were dedicated to reading this book. And for instance, our teacher, who we learned much of this book from in Hadramaut, is that there is 4 or 5 different classes that he has as we speak in different places in Iḥyā Ulūm. So one of the class he's teaching here, another class he's teaching someone else, another class he's teaching somewhere else, and in different places in the Iḥyā. And there's just a continual reading of it. And once you finish it, you go back to the beginning, you keep reading, and you go back to the beginning, and you keep reading, and so forth. So in this last session, it is titled The Heart and the Spiritual Path. And the previous session was about shaytan and his entryways. May Allah Ta'ala suffice us from the evil of shaytan. Wa'udhu billah. Bless us to be able to turn to Allah Ta'ala. And part of the meanings of reliance upon Allah is that He will suffice us. And one of the great things that He suffices us from is the evil of shaytan. And this is why that we say, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ إِلَّهِ النَّاسِ مِنْ شَرِّ الْوَسْوَاسِ الْخَنَّاسِ. And because of the nature of the enemy of shaytan, that we seek refuge in the Rabb al-Nas, the Lord of people, the Maliki Nas, the King wa Ilahi Nas, and the God of people, subhanahu wa ta'ala. From what? From the shar of evil of shaytan. And the last topic that we're going to study here is combining through multiple chapters. And it's titled here, The Heart and the Spiritual Path. In one of these chapters, Imam Ghazali has a very beautiful discussion where he titles it Bayan al-Farq, exposition on the difference between ilham, which is translated as inspiration, and ta'allum, which can translate as learning. Okay, so what is it? He's going to speak about the difference between ilham, unveiling, and ta'allum, and learning. And then he goes on to further clarify wal farq, and the difference between tariq al-Sufiya, the path of the Sufis, fi istikshaf al-haq wa tariq al-nudar, in coming to understand the truth, and the path of the scholars, and literally the theologians. And these paths are not at odds with one another. And one of the things that we'll come to, and that we see that he will encourage indirectly, is a uniting between both. And that is especially the way that we want to be in our time. We want to join between outward knowledge and inward knowledge. We want to join between a study of the outward sciences like Aqidah and Fiqh, and a study of the inner sciences like Tasawwuf. And from here that we can remind ourselves of that famous statement of Imam Malik, is the one, وَمَنْ جَمَعَ بَيْنُهُمَا يعني الفقه والتصوف فقد تحقق. This is a person of true realization. And ultimately balance is what we want. And certainly there are people that incline more towards one than the other, but the scholars of the outward sciences must have a portion of the inward sciences, and the scholars of the inward sciences must have a portion of the outward sciences. And we don't ever see them as mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. Rather, you could even go as far to say, you don't have any access to the inner sciences save through the outward sciences. And one of the proofs of that is that you could bring here the hadith of our Prophet ﷺ about the Quran, where he says, لِكُلِّ آيَةٍ ظَهْرٌ وَبَطْنٌ وَحَدٌّ وَمَطْلَعٌ or مُطَّلَعٌ. Every verse of the Quran has an outward meaning, an inward meaning, a limit, and a matla, yani a rising point, or a muttala, a vantage point. And what they say there is that matla, that rising point, that vantage point, that is the meaning that relates to the deepest spiritual illusion that's in the book of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. And using the second vowling of that word, muttala, that's a vantage point. So in other words, there's no vantage point where you will then witness the inner realities of the meanings of the Quran save through the outward. The Sharia is a protective shell, it's a protective layer through which that we access the haqiqah. Another way of looking at it is, the haqiqah is like the cream or the butter that comes from that very same milk. Okay, another analogy is, it's like the oil that comes from that very same kernel. And so that it's not something different. And that when someone has spiritual realities opened up to them, ultimately it enables them to perform the acts of worship of the sacred law better. So they all go hand in hand. By implementing the Sharia, the sacred law, and taking the path of draw to Allah Ta'ala, then Allah Ta'ala opens up the door for one to witness reality, but then it goes back to help them further travel on that path and put the sacred law under practice in a way that is pleasing to Allah. So this is essential. And this is what we hope that we reach the level of maturity as a community where these meanings are clearly understood so that we can roll up our sleeves and get to work and stop spending our time convincing people of the importance of this and that having to prove it to people. We just got to get to work, and this is what we want to be doing. So in this chapter, he introduces two very important words here, and the word ilham and then the word wahi. So if we speak about them in a technical sense now, is that wahi, of course, is revelation. And revelation is exclusively for prophets. Ilham, on the other hand, is something that a righteous servant can receive. And so our Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that indeed from my ummah are muhaddithin. Not muhaddithin, that's a hadith scholar. A muhaddith. Yani a muhaddath. And they say in commentary, a mulhamin. And then our Prophet went on to say is that وَإِنَّ عُمَرَ لَمِنْهُمْ, indeed Umar ibn al-Khattab is from them. So our Prophet said, indeed from my ummah are those who receive inspiration. They receive a special type. It's not revelation, that's for prophets. And so that's a much higher reality is to receive revelation. But still ilham, inspiration, is something noble. It's something that someone can attain as a follower of a prophet. And this knowledge of ilham is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to when he says in his book, and that they generally say this relates to Sayyidina Khidr, وَعَلَّمْنَاهُ مِن لَدُنَّا ilma, and we taught him knowledge from our presence. Now this is a special type of knowledge. This is a type of knowledge that comes without iktisab or ta'allum. Is that you're not doing something to receive this knowledge. You're not going through the normal process of learning in order to acquire this knowledge. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you. And the scholars say is that this comes after an extended process of purification of the heart. And this type of knowledge could also be referred to as the type of knowledge that Imam al-Ghazali speaks about in book 1 of the Iḥyā, and then throughout the book, the ulum al-mukashafa, the knowledge of unveiling. And I'll point you back to that. We mentioned this, I believe, on Friday night as well, but it's really helpful to understand examples of what are the types of knowledge that someone comes to know when they receive this. And they oftentimes relate to the matters of utter importance in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and things that we need to know on the spiritual path, and that secrets of various legal rulings, that things that are going to happen in the future, a much more heightened awareness by way of unveiling of what's going to happen in the hereafter, and so forth and so on. And that a increased knowledge of what prophethood really is, even though we never fully know what it is, and on and on and on. This is the greatest type of knowledge that someone can be given. And it's actually the only type of knowledge that is sought for in and of itself. Let me repeat. The ulum al-dunya, the knowledge that comes directly from Allah Ta'ala, is the only knowledge that is sought for in and of itself. All other knowledge is a means to attain that knowledge. And so that when we study all the details that we study in the sacred law, this is so that we can believe correctly, so that we can practice correctly, so that we can have our heart be right and have the traits that we're supposed to have, and rid ourselves of the traits that we shouldn't have, so then that the mirror of the heart becomes pure, and then we're ready to receive this greatest knowledge of all, which is knowledge that comes directly from our Lord Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so this is important. This is what is called ilham. Now, what Imam Ghazali then goes on to say, and actually that we will quote a few other that verses and a hadith of our Prophet ﷺ that point to the existence of this knowledge, because this is a chapter in and of itself. But again, I told you we're going to be jumping around from chapter to chapter. Is that he has a chapter where he talks about the shawahid, the proofs of the existence of this type of knowledge. And of course, he mentioned the verse that was just mentioned, وَعَلَّمْنَاهُ مِن لَدُنَّا عِلْمًا, which is one of the greatest proofs of that. That's in Surah Al-Kahf. But then also the hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, مَنْ عَمِلَ بِمَا عَلِمْ, whoever acts upon what he knows, and here meaning knowledge of the sacred law, وَرَّثَهُ اللَّهُ إِلْمَ مَا لَمْ يَعْلَمْ, Allah will give that individual, literally bequeath him, knowledge that he didn't know. So where's this knowledge coming from? This knowledge is coming from Allah Jalla Jalaluh. So whoever puts into practice what it is that they knew, Allah Ta'ala will give them knowledge. This is a type of knowledge that comes from the blessing of acting upon our knowledge. Another scriptural reference is when Allah Ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ, whoever has taqwa of Allah, avoids his prohibitions inwardly and outwardly, implements his commands inwardly and outwardly, what happens? يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا, he will give him a way out. According to one tafsir, one explanation of that, مِنَ الْإِشْكَالَاتِ وَالشُّبَهِ, that all problematic matters and that obfuscations, things that are not clear in the deen, things that you try to understand, how do I understand that? Allah will give someone a makhraj, yani Allah will give them an understanding of how to understand the knowledge of the book and the sunnah and the sciences of the ulama, as a result of having taqwa. وَيَرْزُقُهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ, and then Allah will provide for this individual in ways that he least expects. What is the tafsir according to Imam al-Ghazali? يُعَلِّمُ عِلْمٍ مِنْ غَيْرِ تَعَلُّمٍ وَيُفَطِّنُهُ مِنْ غَيْرِ تَجْرِبَةٍ. Allah will give him knowledge without formal learning. And Allah Ta'ala will give this person sagacity and wisdom without that even having to, without having a lot of experience in something. Then Allah Ta'ala also says in another verse, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, O you who believe, إِن تَتَّقُوا اللَّهِ, if you have taqwa of Allah. So again, it's connected to taqwa. يَجْعَلْ لَكُمْ فُرْقَانًا, he will give you a criterion. So you see, this is the way we're supposed to be. The best book to learn how to be a person of taqwa at a basic level is Bidayat al-Hidayah of Imam Ghazali, the beginning of guidance. This is the best book to read as a starting point if you want to embark upon the path to be a person of taqwa. The whole book is laid out for you to be a person of taqwa. This is the essentials of what it is that you need to know, the basics to embark upon a path to become a person of taqwa. And there's an outward dimension to that, and there's an inward dimension to that, and then there's adab. There are etiquettes that you have, and this is his book. What is the outward dimension of taqwa? What is the inner dimension of taqwa? And what are the various etiquettes and proprieties that we have to have with our Lord, and then all different classifications of people. And if we were just to implement this one book in our time, someone could become from the awliya, and these aren't my words, this is what we've heard our teachers essentially say, is that if someone would just take Bidayat al-Hidayah, it seems like it's a beginning book, which it is. But in our time, were we to even put most of that book into practice, it is very likely that we enter into the ranks of wilayah and that become very close to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala as a result. And alhamdulillah that we still have these books available, and they're still that serving the same purpose that they served throughout the centuries. So when Allah Ta'ala then says, in tattaqullah, if you have taqwa of Allah, yaj'al lakum furqanan, he will give you a criterion. What is that criterion? What is that furqan? Yani, one of scholarly opinion is, nuran yufarraq bihi bayn al-haqq wal-batil. Allah will give you a light in your heart, wherein which you can distinguish truth from falsehood. So this is coming from Allah. And he's relating this as if it's related to ilham. It's related to inspiration. Because this is not something that you're like reading in a book. This is something you're experiencing. This is something internal within you. And then imagine that if you have this and you're able to see through things. And what a blessing. And so that you can then get out of things that were you to do those various things, that they might lead you down the wrong path. And then finally, of course, that we have the blessed hadith of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ittaqu firasat al-mu'min. Beware of the inner sight of the believer. Firasa here is very closely related, as we were talking about last night in one of the sessions, to basira, the inner sight of the believer. فَإِنَّهُ يَنْظُرُ بِنُورِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, because the believer looks with the light of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. What does a light do? Yakshif. Light radiates for us. Were it to be completely dark right now, we wouldn't be able to see anything. Light allows us to see with our physical eye, but also to see with our spiritual eye. And imagine if the light of your spiritual eye became strong. Just as outwardly, by being able to see things, you can protect yourself. And in addition to protecting yourself, figure out the very best thing for you to do. And likewise, spiritually, that light allows you to protect yourself spiritually and to figure out the very best thing that is that you need to do to embark upon the spiritual path. Imam Ghazali mentions the story of Sayyidina Uthman bin Affan, where that he was walking down the street and that it wasn't a passing glance. There was ta'ammul. He that was looking at the beauty of a woman as he was walking down the street, and then he comes into the presence of Sayyidina Uthman bin Affan, and then he says, "Will one of you come into my presence and the traces of zina are upon his eyes?" And because the zina of the eyes is to look at what Allah Ta'ala has not permitted. And then it was said to him, is this wahyun ba'da rasulillah? Is this revelation after messenger of Allah? He says, no. He says, but that this is firasa. And that we know the hadith of our Prophet ﷺ, beware of the firasa, the inner sight of the believer, because he gazes with the light of Allah Ta'ala. And the scholars like this don't use their firasa or their basira to expose people. They use it to nurture people, to help people, to train people, to that encourage people to be good and to avoid what is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And usually what the scholars do is, when they're aware of your faults, is that they cover them. And I remember that one of our teachers said, it was that when someone said to him, knowing that they're people of inner sight and worrying about what's inside of them, and then he said to him, it says that, what do you think, like the awliya are like pigs? They're going to go in and just focus on the dirtiest possible thing in someone? La, the awliya are the opposite, is that they're aware of your faults and they might even see them, but they cover them up on one hand and then bring out the best in you on the other. And so that then the good aspects of you cover up the bad aspects of you. This is what the true people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do for us. So he speaks here then about ilham and wahi. And he then goes on to say, وَحَقِيقَةَ الْقَوْلِ فِيهِ, the word of truth in relation to this. أَنَّ الْقَلْبِ مُسْتِعِدٌ, the heart is ready. It has this ability, this isti'dad, this readiness, this spiritual preparedness for what? لِأَن تَنْجَلِيَ فِي حَقِيقَةِ الْحَقِّ, for the reality of truth to manifest in it, fil ashya'i kullaha, in relation to all things. Then he says, the only thing that becomes between the heart and it reflecting the reality of things are the 5 different means that were previously discussed. That was in Ustaz Amjad's afternoon session yesterday. The 5 reasons wherein which that the heart becomes blocked. And Imam Ghazali was the first to use the heart as a mirror, as a metaphor of the spiritual path. And it is an apt metaphor because of the nature, the amazing nature of mirrors and what it is that they're able to do. But this is what the purpose of the heart is, it's to reflect. And so the whole Ghazalian way of tasawwuf is built upon this metaphor of the mirror. Is that we're meant to, in all of those different ways that were mentioned, is that of course the mirror has to be molded in order and have the right form to begin with. And then of course is that it has to be that polished and all of the rust has to be removed from it. And then of course is that it has to be facing in the right direction. A mirror is not going to reflect. If I want to see my face and I'm pointing the mirror that way, it's not going to help. And that nor can there be any barriers between us and that mirror. And he, as you took yesterday, each one of these he points to the different meanings of it. And then that the most complicated meaning there is that if you're going to use a mirror, for instance, to see that something that's on your backside, you can't just look here. You have to position it such, and maybe even use another mirror. And here, this is what he calls the tariqat al-i'tibar, where you have to do everything essentially at the right time. In other words, is that there's a natural progression in the outward sciences and in the inward sciences. And you can't just jump from here all the way to there. So that if you would jump from, there's a reason that even outwardly, that if you, for instance, medical school, that you have to take the basic classes first. You have to study biology and chemistry. You can't just jump all the way into more advanced studies. You're going to get lost. You didn't fulfill the prerequisites. And likewise in the outward sciences and also in the inward sciences, is that you have to build up slowly. There's things that you have to start with. And then you move to the next things if you're going to really get the benefit of the spiritual path. And then when this happens is that what happens is that the heart can then reflect. And now this is where he gets a little bit esoteric. And you might not have ever heard this before, but I think it's very interesting. And it's not about it being interesting, it's true. He's one of the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he said is that any of these things that cloud the heart or get in the way of the heart or form on the heart, they're like a hijab. They create a veil between the mirror of the heart and between the lawh al-mahfuz. The lawh al-mahfuz is translated as the preserved tablet. But what is the reality of the lawh al-mahfuz? الذي هو منقوش بجميع ما قضى الله به إلى يوم القيامة. That everything that Allah Ta'ala has created and that will create until the day of judgment is imprinted on the lawh al-mahfuz. And so the heart can have some of those realities to various degrees reflected in it. But those 5 reasons that were previously mentioned are what come between the heart and reflecting those realities. And then he says, وَتَجَلِّ حَقَائِقِ الْعُلُومِ مِنْ مِرْآةِ اللَّوْحِ فِي مِرْآةِ الْقَلْبِ يُضَاهِي انطباع صورة مِنْ مِرْآةٍ فِي مِرْآةٍ تُقَابِلُهَا. And so the way that the realities, the haqa'iq of ulum, the realities of knowledge, then are reflected in the heart is similar to the way that an image in one mirror is reflected in another. And then he draws out this metaphor further in all these different ways then that we might not, that things that need to happen in order for us to purify our hearts and to polish the mirrors of them. But then he mentions here something very beautiful. He says, فَإِنَّ الْعُلُومِ إِنَّمَا تَحْصُلُ فِي قُلُوبِنَا بِوَاسِطَةِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. This type of knowledge, this type of spiritual knowledge, this type of knowledge that is associated with light, it is brought about in our hearts through the intermediary of angels. The intermediary of angels. And this is why the angelic presence is so important. And then what he does after he says this is that he lays out for us the path of the people of Tasawwuf. So this is one of the unique instances in the Iḥyā Ulūm al-Dīn where Imam al-Ghazali lays out his way, his method. And this is what is known as the Ghazalian way of Tasawwuf. And of course there's different types of methods. This is one. Imam al-Ghazali's method is not the only method. This is one. And there are other great ulama and awliya that have other methods. And there's a wisdom in these multiple methods so that because the ummah is vast and there's a lot of different types of people, different methods will suit different people. And the whole point is, even though the methods differ outwardly, their goal is one. And it's really no different, as we've heard our teachers say, than the different methods of the scholars of jurisprudence and how they derive law from the Kitab and Sunnah. There's different methods, but the goal is one. To understand the khitab of Allah. What does Allah Ta'ala want us to do? What does He want us to avoid, subhanahu wa ta'ala? There's different methods that the scholars have in order to extrapolate the meanings from the book and the Sunnah. And likewise, on the path to Allah Ta'ala, there are different methods. And so he then notes here that the people of tasawwuf, of this science, is that they incline towards the ulum al-ilhamiyah, the sciences that come by way of inspiration, duna ta'limiyah. What he means here is not that the true people of tasawwuf neglect outward learning, although you might find some people that do that. But really what we want, as we said, is a balance. And the way to truly be a person of tasawwuf is to learn the sacred law and to put it into practice, even at a basic level. But it is possible that someone only learns the basics and then they focus on this method and they become someone who's very close to Allah Ta'ala. That's possible. You don't always have to be a great scholar of outward knowledge to succeed in this spiritual path. And one of the great proofs of that is the companions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ themselves. There were actually very few scholars, but all of them were people of great traits. All of them were people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the blessing of being in the radiant presence of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So he says that, what is the essence of their way? At-tariq, their path is one of taqdeem al-mujahada. They take spiritual struggle very seriously. Mujahada, jahada, yujahidu jihadan mujahadatan. Spiritual struggle. They take it very seriously and they make it a priority. So if you look at what we spoke about yesterday and the decision-making process, you start to see, when you understand that model, how important it is that we embark upon a path of spiritual struggle. This is our life. Every day this is happening. You have a thought, and then what happens after that? And then how do you deal with all? This is the essence of what spiritual struggle is. So their way is a way of spiritual struggle. And they're the ones that say, jahid tushahid. That work hard on yourself. That struggle spiritually. And then you will witness. Yani you will eventually be in a state where that Allah Ta'ala opens the doors of His mercy to you. وَمَحْوَ الصِّفَاتِ الْمَذْمُومَةِ. What is so they have mujahada, spiritual struggle. The second thing is that they want to eliminate, erase all blameworthy traits. So there's a list of blameworthy traits. And one by one, they want to completely rid their hearts of it. And then, وَقَطْعَ اللَّائِقِ كُلِّهَا. They want to sever all attachments to this world. This doesn't mean that they're not in the world. It just means that they're not of the world. And they still might be a family man. They still might be married. They still might have children. They're still going to be around people. But everything changes. They're not attached naturally the way that other people are attached. It's a very different relationship for people that are like this. And the amazing thing is that when they reach the higher stages of this, they actually are better fathers, better mothers, better children to their parents, better friends, better neighbors. Even though they've severed the natural attachments, they actually are better in everything that they do because they are doing everything that they do through Allah and by Allah and for Allah. And He's taken over their affairs. So this is the essence of the path. Mujahada, spiritual struggle. Eliminating the destructive vices, the bad character traits. Severing attachments. But it's worth saying here Do you know how healthy this is for you? It's these attachments, it's these diseases, and the lack of embarking upon the spiritual path is what creates so much mental and physical illness. Is that if you would remove these things from the human being, you would only have mental illness in the rarest of cases, and usually that would be a physical thing that would just require medication. There's nothing you can do about it, that outwardly, and it requires medication. But most of our suffering is because of these things. So the whole thing is that if you embark upon the spiritual path, you're going to be as healthy as you could possibly be. This is the source of all health. And then وَالْإِقْبَالِ بِكُنْهِ الْهِمَّةِ عَلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. Allahu Akbar. This is the fourth thing he mentions. كُنْهِ الْهِمَّةِ, yani with all of your aspiration, you completely set out on a path to Allah. And this word here is a very important, it's called iqbal. Iqbal. Setting out on a path to Allah. And the hope is when we come together in gatherings like this is that people get inspired. Where khalas, they make an intention in their hearts, Ya Rab, I'm going to give my life to you completely. There's nothing more noble than to make the intention to give your life to Allah completely. That's the most noble intention you can possibly make. Ya Rab, I'm giving my life to you completely. And then if we would make that same intention with our children, Ya Rab, I'm giving my children to you completely. This is the secret of the mother of Sayyidina Isa. And that Sayyidatuna Maryam, her mother made the intention and made a vow, in fact. Is that Rabbi inni nadhartu laka ma fi batni muharraran fataqabbal minni. That, oh Allah, that I vow to that devote this child that's in my womb exclusively to your service, so accept this from me. And then eventually that Allah Ta'ala goes on to say that He Himself takes over the tarbiyah of that child as a result. فَأَنْبَتَهَا رَبُّهَا نَبَاتًا حَسَنًا. That now who's the one raising this child? Outwardly it was Hannah, but the reality it was Allah. Because He says, so Allah Ta'ala caused this child to be raised in the very best of ways, and that then Maryam al-Adhra, the Virgin Mary, becomes the mother of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam by way of miracle, and a Siddiqah, a high saint, and one of the perfect women of the world, as our Prophet testified to, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is a sign that a human being can reach human perfection. Kamula is the word that he used, which means to become perfect. And of course, that relatively perfect, absolute perfection is only for Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. But we understand there's meanings of relative perfection. Okay? And there's degrees of relative perfection. And the best way to understand that is to think of a mathematical example. So I like to use basketball metaphors for those of you who know me. So let's just say someone shoots 10 free throws and makes all 10. That's 100%, right? But let's say someone shoots 20 free throws and makes 20. That's also 100%. But which is harder? To make 10 in a row or 20 in a row? Type someone shoots 100 in a row and makes all 100. It's 100%. But that's very different. It's a higher degree. Let's say someone shoots 1,000 free throws and doesn't miss a single free throw. Khalas, that's a higher degree of perfection. So likewise, in relation to our traits, in relation to the inner aspects of the human being, there's degrees of perfection. All prophets reach degrees of perfection, human perfection. But then there's degrees after that. And no one reached a higher degree of relative human perfection than the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sayyidina Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that those who know that. And the only ones that really know that are the prophets. And then to various degrees after that of the Muqarrabeen and the Siddiqeen is that they have doors that open up, but then they get completely perplexed and bewildered by the great state of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala al-Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I was actually just thinking about that the other day. We say these things like the Prophet is the best of creation, which he is. But imagine actually seeing Rasulullah, like in person, and knowing that of everything that Allah created, just think about how big planet Earth is. How many people are on planet Earth and have lived on planet Earth, and how many things are on and in planet Earth, let alone everything else that's out there in the solar system and beyond. Just bringing that meaning to heart that this individual, Sayyidina Rasulullah, is the most beloved of people and all things to Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. Right? He's the one for whom everything was created. What does that mean? When you just think about that meaning, and it opens up a door for us to understand aspects of the Prophet, just that in and of itself, even if we don't know the details of what that means, just think about that. That is just mind-blowing. That he's the best of creation, and we're from his ummah, and we believe in him. And what does that mean? To be the most beloved. What the Sahaba, no one understood it like they did. This is why, look at how they acted. Look at how they believed in the Rasul. Look at how they sacrificed for the Rasul. Look at what they did for the Rasul. Look at how they put into practices, because they were the most aware of people of this reality. In fact, this is the secret in why they were chosen over anyone else. Because no one else on earth had hearts like they did. No one else on earth had traits like they did. And no one else on earth had traits even before in the Jahili period that could then be transferred into Islam to be the very best receptacles to receive the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ and then convey that to the generations after. They were the chosen people to be around the Messenger of Allah. The Prophet was not sent to North America, nor was he sent to Southeast Asia, nor was he sent to Europe, nor was he sent to Africa. He was sent to Mecca al-Mukarram and Medina Munawwara. Khalas. Allah's choice. And there's something special and a reason why that was the case. It was far from haphazard. So these things that he mentions here, this is the essence. Wal iqbal, completely setting out on a path to Allah Ta'ala, bi kunhil himma, with all of your aspiration. Now the question really here is that have we ever even had one moment of that in our life? Where it's like, Ya Rab, my only goal is to draw near to you. Ya Rab, I'm setting on a path to draw near to you. I want to come to know you. And then, remember when we were speaking about those meanings of ta'arrud? This is the essence of how we want to be. So, when we're hearing a qasida, a spiritual poem, our heart should be in a state of iqbal. And if we understand the meanings that are being recited, focus on them. If not, bring to heart general meanings of remembrance or some other object of reflection to make sure your heart is present. But what underlies all that is a heart that is in a state of iqbal. And again, this is a word in Arabic that when you translate it in English, it requires like a phrase. Iqbal is to turn towards Allah, to set out towards Allah. But again, these are just words. The reality is that your heart is doing something to draw near to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we recite the adhkar, like the word al-latif, in that moment, we should be turning towards Allah. We're saying certain things, hopefully reflecting upon the meanings that is triggering then realities within us. But what underlies all of that is this meaning of iqbal. And then what does Imam al-Ghazali say? وَمَهْمَا حَصَى ذَلِكَ, when this happens, كَانَ اللَّهُ هُوَ الْمُتَوَلِّي لِقَلْبِ عَبْدِهِ, then Allah Himself will be the one who takes over the heart of His servant. All we have to do is do those things. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. That's صَرِيح في كتاب الله, explicitly mentioned. Those who strive towards our sake, we will guide them to our ways. You work hard to purify your heart. You work hard to sever the attachments that we have to this world. which already is in our own benefit. And then you turn to Allah completely. And when you do this, Allah will take over the heart of His servant. And if Allah takes over your heart, it's easy to overcome waswasa. It's easy to overcome the thoughts of the nafs. It's easy to do anything that is that we need to do. Khalas. Because Allah is the one taking over our hearts. وَإِذَا وَهُوَ الْمُتَكَفِّلْ بِتَنْوِيرِهِ بِأَنْوَارِ الْعِلْمِ, and Allah will take it upon Himself to that illuminate your heart with the radiance of knowledge. And then what happens? Now, if Allah takes over your affairs, and this is the same meaning, is the meaning, فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُهُ, and when I come to love Him. So the first part is about tahabbub, you doing things to become beloved to Allah. Right, which is to what? To perform the fara'id, the obligations, to do what we can from the nawafil, the voluntary works, until we become beloved to Allah, and then there's an effect. Now Allah has taken over the affair of His servant. فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُ, when I love Him, that, then everything's in effect. So what does He say here? وَإِذَا تَوَلَّ اللَّهُ الْأَمْرَ الْقَلْبِ, after Allah takes over the heart of His, the affair of the heart, فَاضَتْ عَلَيْهِ رَحْمَةً, there will be a constant outpour of mercy upon this individual's heart. And this is the secret of why that the true people of Allah are the ones that really spread the da'wah the most, because they have the most mercy in their hearts. They receive the most mercy from Allah, and thus they're able to be more merciful with people. If you don't receive mercy, you can't give mercy. If Allah doesn't expand your heart, you're not going to be able to do things for people. That the expansion of the heart is a prerequisite to fulfill our duty here on earth. This is why Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam asked for it. Rabbi shrah li sadri. That he asks for an expanded heart, because if you're been charged with conveying the message, if we want to be a means for people into this deen, and our hearts are constricted, and we have bad character, and we're not patient with people, and we're not willing to sacrifice, and we make rash decisions, and we jump the gun, and we make mistakes and say things that we shouldn't say, do things that we should, what kind of da'wah are we going to be able to ultimately spread? The expansion of the heart is a prerequisite for us to that have the ability to really look into matters and to deal with them with wisdom. And of course, there's times where we have to be firm, but then there's many other times where the dictates of wisdom are that we do something else that for a more long-term benefit than something that's short-term. So when Allah takes over the affair of their heart, فَاضَتْ عَلَيْهِ الرَّحْمَةِ, there'll be an outpour of mercy. وَأَشْرَقَ النُّورِ فِي الْقَلْبِ, and the light will be radiant in the heart. وَانْشَرَحَ الصَّدْرِ, and the heart will expand. وَانْكَشَفَ لَهُ سِرُّ الْمَلَكُوتِ. I'm just translating. I don't know what any of this means. I'm translating and hoping from the barakah of studying it with my brothers and sisters is that we receive this. And then the secret of the celestial realm will be unveiled for him. وَانْكَشَعَ عَنْ وَجْهِ الْقَلْبِ حِجَابَ الْعِزَّةِ بِلُطْفٍ رَحْمَةٍ. In other words, is that the veil of might will that be lifted from the face of the heart through the gentleness of His mercy. وَتَلَأَتْ فِيهَا قَائِقَ الْأُمُورِ الْإِلَهِيَّةِ, and then the realities of divine affairs will that shine in the heart. Okay, in other words, is that someone receives something great from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in simple terms. وَلَيْسَ عَلَى الْعَبْدِ إِلَّا الْإِسْتِعْدَادِ بِالتَّصْفِيَةِ الْمُجَرَّدَةِ. The only thing that the servant can do is to prepare for these realities by purifying the heart completely. That is our job. So again, this is book 21, and he's going to have one more introductory book for the second half of the Iḥyā, and then he's going to get into the vice. So he's setting the way for us to do the work. So our teachers, the reason we began 10 or 11 years ago with book 21 was because when our teachers taught this in Tareem, this is how they began. Because they knew that the most important thing of all in the Iḥyā was the third quarter, from the standpoint of the spiritual path of removing the vices from the heart. This is what really blocks people. Because even if you have a lot of virtues, the existence of vices is like having a bucket that has holes in it. You pour water in it and it's being drained out. Whereas the very best way we can worship Allah is to avoid ma'asi, acts of disobedience. Afdal al-ibadah, tark al-ma'asi. The greatest acts of worship is to avoid acts of disobedience. So then, anything that comes to your heart stays in your heart. And so we need to become whole. And we do so by a process of purifying our heart. So all we have to do, the only thing that we can do, is to prepare ourselves by purification of the soul. And then what? وَإِحْدَارَ الْهِمَّةِ مَعَ الْإِرَادَةِ الصَّادِقَةِ. And that we bring to our heart a strong spiritual aspiration, where we have what is called al-irada as-sadiqah. As irada is that this conscious decision, I want to draw near to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, but it's sadiqah, it's true and truthful. وَالتَّعَطُّشْ التَّامِ. And we are completely thirsty. This is literally what ta'atush is. Ta'atush is thirsty. Someone's thirsty. Imagine how, if you prevent yourself from water, how thirsty you would be on a hot day if you haven't drinking for a day or even two, and how much you would want water. This is how we should be in relation to the spiritual path. وَالتَّرَصُّدْ بِدَوَامَ الْإِنْتِظَارِ. And that we are constantly waiting لِمَا يَفْتَحَهُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى مِنَ الرَّحْمَةِ. What Allah Ta'ala will open up to our hearts of mercy. Allahu Akbar. MashaAllah, tabarakallah. And then he goes on to say, to talk about the path of these great people. And so, everything we're describing, this is the path of the people of Tasawwuf. These are the Sufis who do this. So far from being a pejorative in like a negative way of referring to people, this is why the Sufis were so respected traditionally. Because they were people who made their goal Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And were willing to do anything and everything that they could to draw near to Allah ta'ala. How could you not love someone and respect someone like that, where they're willing to sacrifice everything to draw near to their Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala? So then he talks a little bit more about their path, and we'll speak of this here and then move to the next topic as we close. He says their path is one. Some of this is re-emphasized. أولاً بقطع علائق الدنيا بالكلية. Is that they start to sever the attachments that we have here to this world. This doesn't mean, and he's going to mention khalwa, going into solitude here. This doesn't mean that you go home and be like, okay, I'm leaving my job. That, khalas, I'm going to move to Allentown and live out in the countryside and study in a tent when it's raining and snowing in the cold weather, Pennsylvania. But you start to sever your attachments. What it means is you remain where you are unless you're in haram. If you're in haram, get out of the haram, period. If your job is not lawful, get out of it. Find another job. And if it's difficult for you, make the intention and slowly transition out of it until that you can make that transition. But what's meant here is that we start to sever. And yes, of course it's hard. Of course it's hard. But there's things that we can do. And awareness is the first step. But then even on a daily basis, there's things that we can do, intentions. And then even in the moment, preferring Allah, that in certain situations, these will have a remarkable impact upon the heart. وَتَفْرِيغَ الْقَلْبِ مِنْهَا. And literally, emptying your heart of these attachments. بِقَطْعِ الْهِمَّةِ. And this is going to sound harsh. عن الأهل والمال والولد والوطن is that you sever your aspiration from your family, from your wealth, from your children and your homeland. وعن العلم and from knowledge. والولاية in any position of authority. والجاه and any fame. There's no way to Allah Ta'ala if we're being gripped by any of these things. I told you it was harsh. It doesn't mean that you go home and tell your spouse, like, I'm embarking upon the spiritual path now, and I was told that I'm supposed to sever my attachments from you. They're going to be like, you're crazy. No, this is something internal. But this is really important. If you want to really have a healthy relationship, this is actually required. The awliya love their children, but they don't love their children the same natural way that other people love their children. The awliya love their spouses, but they don't love their spouses in the same. I know this sounds weird, and maybe we'll need a whole Q&A session like on this, but this is actually part of the secret of having true relationships. And there's nothing wrong with liking your wealth, but if you sever your attachments to your wealth, you're now positioning yourself to actually benefit from your wealth more. If you sever, we all love our homeland naturally, but if you sever the attachments to your homeland, I remember being, subhanAllah, in the San Jose airport with Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah. It was such an amazing, that learning moment. And he was on a flight, he was getting ready to get on a flight back to Chicago. He was just trying to create conversation. I said, you know, Sayyidi, do you consider Chicago home? He just kind of looked at me. And he said that where I am in the moment is home. Right? He says, wherever I am in the moment, that's home. And he said it with a had, like with a state. And that's just so powerful. Imagine, yani, naturally we're familiar with home, our bed, our home, the area, we know how to do things. You're naturally more as a human being. And when we travel, you know, we miss home, we miss things back home. Imagine if your heart could be in the same way, whether you're home or whether you're traveling. Where like you're perfectly content wherever you are and your heart is the same. What an amazing state to be in. Whether you're in prison, whether you are that in tribulation, whether you are in that ease, your heart is the same. This is how the true people of Allah are. And we just learn about them so that we can try to be like them one day. But true healing air is in these meanings. And so to really progress in the spiritual path is that this, and this is actually really important. And even with our spouses, and you shouldn't want your spouse to love you for the sake of you. Is that your spouse is going to be a better spouse if everything they're doing for you is actually really for Allah, and it's for you, but by extension of being for Allah, and there's a difference. And again, it sounds like other than the way, but this is actually where the relationships actually become even better when these things happen. So severing our attachments and our aspiration from family, from wealth, from children, from our homelands, from even the knowledge that we have, and from authority, positions of authority, and from jah. This is everything that people are chasing in the dunya here. That's just a list right there. There it is. That's all manifestations of the dunya. And it doesn't mean that you don't have family or work or money or any of that. But you don't let it grip you. All of these things here could potentially prevent you from drawing near to Allah Ta'ala. And بل يسير قلبه إلى حالة يستوي فيها وجود كل شيء وعدمه. Is that rather your heart, a state overcomes it, where whether you have something or you don't is the same. ثم يخلو بنفسه في زاوية مع الاقتصار على الفرائض والرواتب. Now he's mentioning something specific here, then I'll translate and then explain it. Rather, he goes into a state of solitude and a zawiyah, in a place of remembrance of Allah Ta'ala, and focuses only on performing the obligations and the voluntary works that are associated with them. وَيَجْلِسْ فَارِغَ الْقَلْبِ, and he sits with an unoccupied heart, مَجْمُوء الْهَمْ, completely focused. ولا يفرق فكره بقراءة القرآن ولا بالتأمل في تفسيره ولا بكتب حديث ولا بغيره. He doesn't go through a process of formal learning at this point. بل يجتهد ألا يخطر ببالي شيء سوى ذكر الله تعالى. He strives to only have the remembrance of Allah Ta'ala come to your heart, to his heart. فلا يزال بعد جلوسه في الخلوة قائلا بلسانه. He continues as he's sitting in a state of solitude, Allah, 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 على الدوام مع حضور القلب, continuously with presence of heart. And then he goes into detail to describe what happens after that. Now, we don't necessarily have to do it in this specific way. But what is meant here, and at very least, we should have times of our day where we sit alone, undistracted, and make dhikr. And if someone has a teacher, then your teacher might appoint for you what that dhikr might be. If someone does not have a teacher, the recommended dhikr would be to say La ilaha illallah. That was appointed to us directly by Rasulullah. And I would recommend even potentially doing something like timing yourself. I'm going to go into a state of khalwa, solitude, for 5 minutes. And I would just say that. Don't even count. You don't even have to count on a subha. Set your timer for 5 minutes. Or if you could do 10, that's even better. And then just very slowly, because the point here is not numbers. It's about the effect it has on your heart. And then just say over and over, very slowly, La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. And just reflect upon the meaning. Or if you would prefer, if there's another dhikr that you like subhanallah, or alhamdulillah, or la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, whatever works for you. These are all over-the-counter dhikrs that we can do. But the point is, we have a point of our day where you shut everything out. If thoughts come into your mind, you don't even fight them, just let them go. Because the more you engage a thought, the more that it's going to come back again. The secret of overcoming our thoughts is to disengage and to replace them, that every time that you have a bad thought of some sort, is that immediately preoccupy yourself with a good thought. That's the very best way to overcome thoughts, including intrusive thoughts. It's just to not fight them. And obviously, by the fact that you are replacing it with a good thought means that you dislike that thought, so that the thought is atoned for to begin with. The very fact that you're saying something else means that you're turning away from khalas. You don't need to preoccupy yourself with it. It's more worthy that we preoccupy ourselves with how we want to be. The last point here that I just thought that this was a very beautiful thing that he says here, because it's time to end. He has this point here where he talks about the iman of the common Muslim. He says that their light is like the light of a siraj, like a lamp. He says some of them, their light is like the light of a candle. He says that the light of the Siddiqeen is like the light of the moon and the stars. And he says that the light of the prophets is like the light of the sun. He says, وَكَمَا يَنْكَشِفُ فِي نُورِ الشَّمْسِ صُورَةُ الْآفَاقِ مَا اتِّسَاءِ أَقْطَارِهَا وَلَا يَنْكَشِفُ فِي نُورِ السِّرَاجِ إِلَّا الزَّاوِيَةِ الضَّيِّقَةِ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ. He says, just as the sun, because of its intensity, is it can lighten up that which is from east to west. Whereas if you have a small lamp that lighten up that a corner of a room. فَكَذَلِكَ تَفَاوُتُ إِنْشِرَاحِ الصُّدُورِ بِالْمَعَارِفِ وَانْكِشَافِ سِعَةِ الْمَلَكُوتِ بِقُلُوبِ الْعَارِفِينَ. This is a metaphor of the different ranks of the expansion of the heart with ma'arif, that experiential knowledge, and what is unveiled of the vastness of the celestial realms to the hearts of the righteous. And just as you could say that the sun is a type of light and the lamp is a type of light, but there's a big difference. between how much they radiate in relation to that. And so inshallah ta'ala, we will stop there, and may Allah ta'ala make our portion great from these meanings, even if we see ourselves as distant from them, which we might be. But the fadl of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wasi'. One of the greatest things that we learn from our teachers is that despite ourselves still ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His bounty. One of the last hikam of Ibn that we took was a very important hikam. And it says is that La nihayata limadhammika idha arja'aka ila nafsik. Is that there's no end to your blame if He returns you to yourself. If Allah returns us to ourselves, there's no end to how blameworthy we are. Everything about us is blameworthy. We talk about our own selves. But then He says, وَلَا تَفْرُغُ مَدَائِحُكَ. Right? لَا تَفْرُغُ مَدَائِحُكَ إِذَا أَظْهَرَ عَلَيْكَ جُودُهُ كَمَا قَالَ. That there's no end to your praise if that He manifests His generosity in you. So in and of our own selves, what can we possibly do that is praiseworthy if we're left to ourselves? But insofar as it is a manifestation of His munificence and generosity, there's no end. But at that point, it's not about us. It's about His generosity. And so knowing that reality, despite our state, no matter where we're at, even if we're struggling to adhere to the 5 prayers, we should never think that there's not great stations that we can attain from the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially now in the end of time where there's so few people who believe, where there's so few people who are embarking upon a path. The Maidan is completely open for people. And what we need to be is to be people who are true seekers. And inshallah ta'ala, when we come together like this is a hope, is that we will assist one another and encourage one another. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept us as we are, to have mercy upon our weakness, and to open up the doors for us to benefit and to set on a path to draw near to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.